The boarding gate was loud with chatter, the kind of dull noise that comes from too many voices pressed together in one space. Most people noticed the sharp suits of the businessmen juggling phones, the families herding kids with sticky fingers, and the group of young soldiers moving in a loose pack, laughing louder than necessary. No one paid attention to the woman who moved through the line with her head slightly bowed, her hair a chestnut brown cut in a shag that brushed against her cheeks. She carried nothing but a plain backpack, its straps frayed, and wore faded jeans that had seen better days. To anyone watching, she was unremarkable, maybe a budget traveler who had scraped together just enough for a transatlantic ticket. Isla Becker didn't stand out. That was the point. She offered the flight attendant a small nod as she passed, slipped into her seat near the middle of the cabin, and tucked her bag neatly beneath her feet. She didn't fidget or sigh impatiently like others did. She simply sat, hands folded loosely in her lap, her hazel eyes resting on the window where clouds already gathered on the horizon. The attendants moved down the aisle, handing out drinks, repeating the same instructions they'd given 100 times before. None of them gave her a second look. The flight lifted into the night, the city lights shrinking beneath until they vanished into blackness. Hours passed in routine. Dinner trays clattered, soda cans cracked open, children cried and eventually fell asleep, and a few soldiers in the back swapped stories, their voices carrying over the rows. Isla remained silent, her stillness almost unnatural, as though she was waiting for something the rest of the plane hadn't yet imagined. Halfway across the Atlantic, the routine broke. The cabin door near the galley slammed open, a sound sharp enough to slice through the murmur of half-asleep passengers. 4 men rushed in, masks covering their faces, rifles raised. Shouts in harsh, accented English filled the aisle. Down, everyone down. Their voices rattled against the overhead bins. A woman screamed. A baby wailed. Panic spilled like water loosed from a broken dam. Passengers dove for the floor, some frozen in their seats, until the butt of a rifle struck close enough to jolt them into movement. One hijacker yanked a businessman from his chair, throwing him against the window. Another kicked over a food cart, metal clattering and trays scattering across the aisle. The tallest of the group stormed toward the cockpit, dragging one of the flight attendants by the arm. The door slammed shut behind them, chains rattling, locking the pilots away. Near the front, a man in plain clothes sat straighter, though his body remained still. His hair was clipped short, his jaw square, the kind of face that carried command even when it was quiet. Commander Nathan Cross, decorated Navy SEAL, traveling without uniform, without insignia, just another passenger on leave. His eyes, though, were different, sharp, calculating, moving from one masked man to the next. He measured distances, weapons, angles. Every muscle in him demanded action, but he knew better. Too many civilians, too much risk. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to wait. He scanned the cabin again, and that was when his eyes caught her. Isla Becker, still in her seat, not ducking, not screaming, not moving at all. She sat as though the chaos belonged to another world. Her hands remained folded, her breathing even, her gaze steady on the men storming the aisle. Nathan's eyes narrowed. Everyone else had become frantic shadows, trembling, sobbing, cowering in fear. But not her. She was a stone in the flood, silent, immovable. For a moment, he forgot the men with guns. His focus pinned to her, this quiet passenger who seemed to be waiting, just as he was, but for what only she knew. The hijackers wasted no time making their presence absolute. One of them stormed out of the cockpit with both pilots in tow, their hands bound, their faces pale with the stunned disbelief of men ripped from control of their own ship. Another slammed the reinforced cockpit door shut, looping heavy chains through the handles, the rattle of metal loud enough to cut through the sobs of passengers. The sound of the padlock snapping shut echoed like a verdict. The plane was theirs now. Phones, one barked, his accent sharp, his rifle sweeping across the rows. All of them, out, now. Passengers scrambled, trembling hands fumbling in pockets and purses, tossing their lifelines into the aisle where they clattered in a growing pile. Heads down. The leader snapped, pacing slowly, daring anyone to resist. The air seemed to thicken, every breath heavier, the cabin shrinking under the weight of fear. Nathan Cross watched with the restraint of a man who had trained his entire life not to act on impulse. His instincts clawed at him to move, to strike, but his discipline held. There were too many innocents, too many guns, and not enough margin for error. These men weren't amateurs. Their spacing was deliberate, their grips firm, their eyes scanning with the precision of soldiers who had rehearsed this. Ruthless, trained, and dangerous. His jaw flexed, the muscle ticking, as he sat perfectly still, calculating. He forced his gaze to sweep the cabin again. Most passengers were folded into themselves, arms over heads, bodies trembling, lips pressed against prayer or whimpers. But then he saw her, Isla Becker. She hadn't folded in on herself. She sat upright, her knees squared, her hands resting neatly atop them. They weren't clenched, they weren't shaking. They were steady, quiet, as if her pulse hadn't risen at all. Nathan narrowed his eyes. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't numbness, it was control. The kind he had seen only in soldiers who had lived through too many fires to flinch at smoke. One of the hijackers noticed her too. He broke from his patrol and strode toward her row, his boots pounding against the carpeted floor. "You," he snapped, his voice dripping with aggression. "Why so quiet?" He leaned closer, his masked face inches from hers. She didn't move, didn't blink. The stillness seemed to mock him more than defiance would have. With a growl, he seized her arm and yanked her up hard enough that the seam of her shirt stretched. Fabric pulled, collar slipping just enough to reveal the faint edge of a tattoo along her shoulder blade. Nathan's eyes locked on it instantly. The black lines were faded but unmistakable. A serpent coiled into a mark he had seen only once before, in files whispered about in secure rooms. His chest tightened, his breathing caught for a second. No civilian carried that mark. No soldier outside a certain circle even dared to. The hijacker shoved her back into her seat, clearly unimpressed, muttering something about cowards hiding behind silence. Isla lowered her gaze, adjusted her collar, and said nothing. Nathan, though, felt something shift. The silence wasn't cowardice, it was choice. The mark confirmed it. The unit tied to that tattoo was supposed to be gone, dissolved, buried by governments that didn't want to admit it had ever existed. Ghosts, they called them. Ghosts erased from record. Yet here she was, alive, breathing, sitting in the middle of a hijacked plane with her hands still steady on her knees. His respect was instant, sharp as a blade unsheathed. He didn't know who Isla Becker really was, but he knew this: she wasn't just another passenger. And the hijackers had no idea what kind of silence they had tried to break. The first attempt at resistance came from a man in a business suit near the front of the cabin. He had been sweating since the moment the guns appeared, his knees bouncing, his fingers twitching like he was trying to build the courage to do something. When one of the hijackers turned his back for a second, the man lunged forward, clutching at the rifle's barrel with both hands, shouting something that was swallowed by the chaos. For half a heartbeat, hope sparked in the air, hope that maybe someone could turn the tide. It ended in seconds. Another hijacker swung the butt of his weapon down hard, catching the man across the temple with a sickening crack. He collapsed in the aisle, groaning, blood seeping into the carpet. The leader of the group stepped over him without hesitation, pressing his boot into the man's chest as though he were stepping on nothing more than a bundle of clothes. The message was clear: no resistance. No heroes. The cabin fell into silence except for the quiet sobbing of a woman a few rows back. Every passenger shrank further into their seats, terror locking them into obedience. The hijackers moved methodically now, tearing through overhead bins, dragging luggage into the aisle, ripping open bags. Passports, wallets, electronics, all tossed into piles that grew into a mountain of lives stripped bare. A child whimpered when her stuffed animal was taken, the sound cut off by her mother's hand pressed to her mouth. The air was heavy with fear, a pressure that seemed to make the cabin smaller with every passing second. Nathan Cross sat rigid, his body thrumming with coiled energy. Every nerve screamed at him to move, to do something, but he forced the instinct down. Timing was everything. He knew what these men were: organized, disciplined, not the kind to make mistakes easily. One wrong move and half the cabin would be dead before he reached the first gun. He ground his teeth, his hands flexing on his knees. His entire career had been built on action, but right now restraint was the only weapon he had. And then, once again, his gaze slid to her. Isla Becker. She sat as though the violence around her had passed straight through, leaving her untouched. Not numb, not broken, something else. A stillness so complete it radiated weight, as if she were holding back something the rest of the world couldn't comprehend. For the first time, she met his eyes. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, and for a moment, Nathan felt like the roles had reversed, as if she were the one assessing him. One of the hijackers noticed her silence and didn't like it. He stalked toward her row, his boots loud against the carpet. "You," he snarled, jabbing the muzzle of his rifle under her chin. "Speak, beg." His voice rose, thick with anger that she hadn't given him the reaction he wanted. Isla didn't move. Her eyes didn't even flicker. Her hands remained on her knees, perfectly still. The longer her silence stretched, the more unsettled he became. His grip tightened on the rifle, his breathing quickened. He wanted fear, and she gave him nothing. With a growl, he shoved her back into her seat and stormed away, muttering under his breath. The passengers closest to her flinched, waiting for her to break, but she simply adjusted her collar and remained silent. Nathan's pulse thundered. This wasn't defiance, this was discipline, a kind he had seen only in operators who had lived and bled through more than most men could imagine. He knew now, whatever she wasn't ordinary. He made his decision. Leaning slightly, his movement masked by the chaos in the aisle, Nathan shifted his body toward her. His hand slid with deliberate precision, the cold metal of his sidearm pressed low against the edge of her seat. He caught her eyes again, and in that steady silence, he gave her the only signal he could. His lips barely moved, but the words were clear. "Show me who you are." Her fingers closed over the weapon without hesitation. Not fumbling, not uncertain, perfect grip, perfect control. And in that instant, Nathan knew he wasn't alone anymore. The balance in the cabin had just shifted, and the hijackers had no idea. Isla's hand slid over the metal, closing with a certainty that erased any doubt. She didn't even glance at the weapon Nathan had risked sliding to her. Her grip was flawless, her fingers fitting as though the steel had been molded for her alone. The muzzle dipped just enough to keep it hidden from the aisle, but her posture didn't change, her breathing didn't hitch. Every line of her body remained steady, composed, calm. Nathan felt the tight coil in his chest finally unwind into certainty. No civilian carried themselves like that. No tourist or stray passenger could take a weapon in the middle of a hijacking and look as though it belonged in her hands. He leaned back, letting the seat cushion absorb the tension he had carried since the first shout, and allowed the smallest flicker of a smile to cut across his face. He knew now. The cabin, though, felt it before anyone put words to it. A strange, fragile silence settled over the passengers who could see her. Their terror thinned into something else, something almost reverent. Whispers rippled down the rows like a current, not loud enough for the hijackers to notice, but carrying an energy that made heads lift ever so slightly. Who was this woman? Isla rose. Not fast, not reckless, but with the deliberate precision of someone who knew every eye was on her and wanted it that way. She didn't hunch or shrink. She unfolded from her seat slowly, her shoulders squared, the pistol low against her thigh. The motion was quiet, seamless, as though she had rehearsed it 1,000 times in shadows no one else had seen. The metallic click of the chamber sliding into place was muffled beneath the hum of the engines, but those close enough to hear it froze. The sound wasn't just mechanics, It was a promise. She hadn't even looked down when she racked the slide, her fingers moving from memory, from muscle trained long before this flight. The act was second nature. The hijackers were too focused on the luggage, on barking orders and corralling fear, to see it, but the passengers did. Wide eyes lifted, lips parted, hearts that had been racing with panic now stumbling for a different reason. The woman they had written off as invisible, the one mocked for her silence, now stood armed and unyielding in the middle of the nightmare. Nathan's gaze stayed fixed on her, his eyes sharp but no longer burning with restraint. The grim smile deepened, the kind that belonged to a man who had just realized the battlefield had shifted in his favor. He didn't know her name, not really. He didn't know where she had come from or why she had boarded this flight looking like a shadow of an ordinary life. But he knew exactly what she was. She wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't a civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was something else, something born of silence and trained in shadows, lethal in ways that only a handful of people on Earth could understand. And the men with rifles, the men who thought they controlled the cabin, had no idea what storm they had just woken. The engines droned on, the plane cutting across the Atlantic night, but inside the fuselage the air was taut, ready to snap. Isla stood calm, unblinking, the gun steady in her hand. Around her, passengers clung to the edges of their seats, caught between terror and awe. Nathan leaned back, eyes locked on her, his thoughts sharp and certain. The fate of every soul on board was about to change, though the hijackers hadn't noticed yet. They would. Isla didn't tremble. She didn't speak. She simply stood, weapon ready, a calm shadow rising against the storm. The cabin seemed to stop breathing altogether, waiting for the first move that would break the silence forever.